What was truly the moment that changed everything? Why did a seemingly inevitable decision end up triggering consequences that no one wanted to foresee? How is it possible that the signs were there and yet no one interpreted them correctly? But there is something even more disturbing. While everyone looked at the obvious problem, another silent conflict was growing in the shadows. Today we are going to reconstruct this story step by step. Stay until the end to understand what really happened.
From the beginning, everything seemed to follow the logical course of events. The decisions made were not improvised, the circumstances were not unknown, and the environment offered signs that, in appearance, could be clearly interpreted. However, what no one imagined was that beneath that surface of normalcy, the true conflict was brewing that would end up defining every subsequent step. The context in which the events took place was marked by a combination of external pressure and internal expectations. On one hand, there were objective factors that conditioned every move. On the other, there were personal motivations, commitments made, and an image that had to be maintained before others. That duality generated a constant tension, invisible to many, but determining in every decision adopted. The first indications of the problem were neither loud nor dramatic. They appeared gradually, almost imperceptibly. Small details that could have been interpreted as warnings, comments that seemed harmless, situations that, at the time, did not seem serious enough to alter the planned course. And yet, they were there, marking the beginning of a chain of events that would end up being irreversible. Confidence played a fundamental role in this stage. Confidence that everything was under control. Confidence that circumstances would resolve themselves. Confidence that accumulated experience would suffice to face any unexpected difficulty. That apparent security allowed the conflict to advance without resistance, growing silently, while attention remained focused on other matters considered more urgent. At the same time, the pressure was increasing. External expectations demanded results. Decisions had to be made quickly. There was no room to show doubt or hesitation. In that scenario, recognizing that something was not working would have implied questioning not only a specific strategy, but an entire structure of prior beliefs and commitments. Thus, the main conflict was established without anyone naming it directly. It was not yet an open crisis, but it already conditioned the environment, the conversations, and the direction of events. What seemed like just another stage within a logical process was in reality laying the groundwork for the breaking point that would come later. And while everything continued to advance with apparent normalcy, the crucial question began to take shape. Was it possible to stop what was already underway? Or was the outcome inevitable from the first moment?
With the conflict already sown, events began to advance with relentless logic. Nothing exploded overnight. There was no dramatic instant that changed everything immediately. On the contrary, it was the accumulated weight of small decisions that narrowed the margin of maneuver until what was manageable became uncontrollable. Every step seemed justified at the moment it was taken. Circumstances offered convincing arguments. There were practical, strategic, and even emotional reasons that supported what was being done. From the outside, the process could seem coherent. From within, it was experienced as an inevitable sequence of necessary choices. But that very sense of inevitability was part of the problem. The signs that were once subtle began to become more visible. The consequences started to manifest in concrete ways. What was once a suspicion transformed into evidence. However, admitting it implied recognizing that the course adopted might not be the right one, and that possibility proved too costly, both personally and publicly. The environment also began to react. Some voices pointed out doubts, others defended the continuity of the initial plan. A climate of tension was generated that forced people to take a side. It was not just a matter of facts, but of loyalties, of consistency with past decisions, and of a reputation built over years. Changing direction did not mean only modifying a strategy. It meant accepting that something had been misinterpreted from the start. At this point, the conflict ceased to be silent. Although it had not yet exploded, its presence was evident in every conversation, in every gesture, and in every prolonged silence. Psychological pressure increased.
The doubts that could previously be ignored began to weigh more. The distance between what was expected and what was actually happening became increasingly difficult to justify. Even so, the impulse to move forward prevailed. Stopping seemed more dangerous than continuing. Retreating implied assuming immediate losses. Moving forward offered at least the hope that the final result would compensate for the present tensions. That hope was the engine that sustained subsequent decisions, even when signs pointed to the margin of error rapidly shrinking. The most disturbing thing was that the secondary conflict, the one brewing in the shadows from the start, began to have a decisive influence. It was not just about external facts, but an internal wear and tear that altered clarity of judgment. Pressure, pride, the fear of failing, and the need to maintain a solid image began to condition the interpretation of reality. Thus, the development of the conflict was not an unexpected accident, but the logical result of a series of choices sustained over time. And as the consequences became more visible, a question began to impose itself forcefully. Was it still possible to correct the course, or had the point of no return already been passed? When the conflict reached this point, it was no longer solely about concrete facts or strategic decisions. The emotional dimension began to take center stage. What until then could be explained with rational arguments began to feel like a constant burden, difficult to sustain, and even harder to acknowledge publicly. The accumulated tension transformed the perception of every event. What was previously interpreted as a surmountable obstacle began to be experienced as a direct threat. Criticisms, which at another time would have been taken as part of the process, now felt personal. Every error, no matter how small, acquired a disproportionate weight. The psychological margin for tolerating uncertainty was rapidly diminishing. In parallel, the second problematic axis, the one that had remained in the background since the beginning, began to reveal itself clearly. It was not just a matter of results or visible consequences, it was a matter of identity, of internal coherence, and of the image projected to the outside world. The conflict ceased to be solely external and became an intimate confrontation between what had been promised and what was actually occurring. External pressure continued to grow. Expectations did not diminish. On the contrary, they intensified. Every new move was observed, analyzed, and questioned. The need to demonstrate control became almost obsessive. However, the more security was projected, the more evident the fragility of the balance achieved became. In this context, decisions began to be made under a much greater emotional burden. They were no longer simple strategic choices. They were responses to an increasingly demanding environment and an internal battle that silently wore things down. The fear of admitting a mistake competed with the fear that the situation would worsen if firm action was not taken. That constant tension affected clarity of judgment and conditioned every subsequent step. The environment also changed its attitude. Some support began to weaken. Doubts arose that were not previously expressed aloud. Relationships became more strained. Silence began to have a different meaning, charged with uncertainty. It was not just about results, but about trust, and trust, once eroded, is difficult to recover. As the situation progressed, the emotional conflict overtook the operational conflict. Discussions were no longer only about concrete facts, but about credibility, responsibility, and consistency. Every decision now had a double impact, practical and symbolic, and that symbolic weight was, in many aspects, the most difficult to manage. The most revealing part of this stage was understanding that the true critical point was not only in external events, but in the inability to reconcile reality with the expectation built over so much time. The gap between the two became too evident to ignore. Thus, the process reached a level where any move involved significant risk. Moving forward could deepen the damage. Retreating could confirm existing doubts. The tension reached an intensity that no longer allowed for partial solutions. And then the question ceased to be whether the conflict could be managed and became another, much more uncomfortable one. Who would bear the final cost of everything that was happening? The moment of maximum tension did not arrive accompanied by a formal announcement or an unequivocal sign. It arrived as real breaking points usually do, when the accumulation of pressure exceeds the capacity for containment. Everything that had been attempted to be held up began to give way all at once. Doubts could no longer be disguised. Consequences ceased to be hypotheses and became concrete facts. The decisions made in previous stages began to show their impact clearly and visibly. What could previously be justified with reasonable arguments now demanded deeper explanations. The margin of interpretation narrowed. The narrative that had maintained a certain balance began to fragment. Every detail was examined with an implacable magnifying glass, and every contradiction acquired a larger dimension. At that point, external pressure reached its highest level. The expectations that once drove things forward now transformed into demands. It was no longer about staying the course, but about being held accountable for the results. Responsibility ceased to be shared in a diffuse way and began to concentrate. The focus narrowed. Questions became direct and difficult to avoid. Internally, the emotional toll was evident. The tension accumulated throughout the process manifested in rushed decisions, in attempts to quickly fix what had taken time to build. However, every attempt at adjustment seemed to generate new complications. The margin for maneuver was minimal. The sense of control, which had been a constant at the start, vanished almost completely. The consequences did not only affect the immediate level, they also impacted public perception, credibility, and the trust built over time. What was at stake was no longer just the outcome of a specific process, but the global image that had been projected for years. And when that image begins to crack, reconstruction is complex. The environment reacted intensely. Some positions hardened. Others opted for distancing. The debate ceased to be technical and became deeply symbolic. Every action was interpreted as a statement of intent, every silence as an implicit admission. Pressure did not come only from the facts, but from the meaning attributed to them. In that scenario, the conflict reached its clearest form. There was no longer room for ambiguity. The consequences were real, tangible, and visible. Final decisions had to be made under a light that did not allow mistakes or nuances to be hidden. Everything was exposed. And then something fundamental became evident. The point of maximum tension was not just the result of a series of events, but the culmination of a process in which early warnings had been minimized. What started as discrete signs ended up becoming a crisis impossible to ignore. The final question at this moment no longer revolved around whether the conflict could be avoided. That possibility was left behind. The issue was another, much more determining one. How would the consequences be assumed? And what impact would that assumption have on the immediate future?
When the point of maximum tension finally stabilized, it did not do so with a sense of absolute relief, but with a clearer awareness of the accumulated cost. The resolution was not a spectacular turn or a resounding victory. It was, rather, the acceptance of the consequences and the need to face what happened without the protection of previous narratives. The final decisions marked a before and after, not because they erased the errors, but because they forced them to be owned. Responsibility ceased to be an abstract matter and became a concrete act. That moment defined the true outcome of the conflict, not so much because of what changed externally, but because of the internal transformation it involved. The impact was visible. Public perception was no longer the same. Trust needed to be rebuilt. Affected relationships required time and consistency to be restored. Nothing went back exactly to the starting point. And yet, within that permanent alteration, a clarity also emerged that did not exist before. The process left inevitable lessons. The first was that early signs are rarely irrelevant. Ignoring them does not eliminate them. It only delays the moment they become impossible to avoid. The second was that internal conflict is often as decisive as external conflict. Resistance to recognizing a fissure can end up widening it. Looking back, the entire journey reveals a logical sequence. It wasn't an isolated accident or an unpredictable event. It was the accumulated consequences of decisions made under pressure, sustained by the confidence that control was enough to neutralize any risk. But reality proved that control has limits, especially when the emotional and symbolic impact of each step is underestimated. The resolution did not mean closing the story completely. It meant redefining it, accepting that the outcome, although inevitable in its final stage, could have been different if the first warnings had been attended to with more attention. That reflection is perhaps the most valuable element of the entire process. In the end, what remains is not just the memory of the conflict, but the understanding of how it was brewed and how it was faced.
because every story of this type leaves an open question that transcends concrete facts. When the first signs of tension appear, do we have the ability to recognize them in time? And if we recognize them, do we have the courage to act before the cost is irreversible? End of script.